Hello and welcome to everyone wherever you are around the world. Delighted to welcome you to the latest in the series of GSOA webinars, this one focusing particularly on the future of space in Europe and in particular the implications of the forthcoming EU Space Act and what that means for industrial resilience. My name's John Worthy. I'm a partner and the head of the space law team at international law firm Field Fisher, based in London. And just to say that this event is brought to you in partnership with Proactive PR International and Novaspace, who support us in working with industrial leaders and promoting high quality content. So that'll help to inform GSOA members, create meaningful discussions and address some of the critical issues that are shaping our industry at the moment. I'm delighted to welcome an absolutely stellar panel of commentators from across the industry today. We have Jordi Casanova, Head of Telecoms and Space at Amazon. We have Shinez Bouafia, Head of Regulatory International Affairs, Space and Telecoms at Eutelsat. Vinny Aloya, Head of Legal and Regulatory Affairs and Space Policy at Astroscale. And last but not least, Cecile Amiel, Director of Regulatory Affairs at SES. But just to give you a few thoughts before we leap into the questions for the panel. I guess it's fair to say that the European space sector is at an important inflection point. So we've got a vibrant industry. We've got some really fascinating, innovative space businesses coming to the fore, alongside some well-established players across the industry. And I think increasingly, both across industry and within the political governmental domain, everybody recognises that space activity is absolutely central to the future of Europe. And last year we have the European Commission setting out its key objectives for the future of the space industry, in particular capturing a number of key objectives in the Draft Space Act, focusing on safety, resilience, sustainability, and above all, perhaps legal certainty. At the same time, ensuring as far as possible that Europe maintains its competitive position and strategic autonomy. Of course, those are all great principles, difficult to disagree with many of them. However, the real challenge is translating that into reality, real life practice in a sector that is not just Europe-wide, but global and indeed beyond global in some cases, as well as becoming increasingly complex on a technological level. So, many of the delegates will have seen the submissions made by GSOA in connection with the Act, highlighting in particular that space regulation must recognise the significant long development and investment cycles in the sector. We all know how long it takes to build satellites, even though, as we know equally, development periods are increasingly compressed. And so decision making is a long-term exercise. What we think about now may take quite a number of years, maybe half a decade, before it comes to reality. At the same time, certainly as a lawyer, I'm very conscious that legal clarity and certainty is vital. What we see in the Act is an attempt to improve harmonisation, bringing reducing fragmentation across the member states. However, there are a number of comments that have been raised over recent months about the scope, the clarity, the certainty that the Act would deliver, and whether you're a professional advisor or whether you're an industry player, then understanding the clarity and certainty in the sector is critical. Uncertainty undermines business, undermines investment cases, and makes everybody's life that much more difficult. Alongside that, there's clearly a bunch of EU legislation that already impacts on our sector, particularly in the areas of cybersecurity and resilience. So with NIS2, with the Cyber Resilience Act already playing their role, then we need to grapple with the question about how they sit alongside the proposals on cybersecurity and resilience in the Act. And then, of course, we need to look internationally, particularly in a sustainability context. That we need to recognise that there are a number of international standards, both well established and some emerging, and to ensure that there is fair and reciprocal access to markets for the benefit of the industry right round the world. And also to recognise that sustainability is, in some people's view, an existential threat to the space business as a whole. So we need to engage with that, work out what is a pragmatic and achievable way of dealing with sustainability while still promoting the vital services that the space business can achieve. So plenty of issues on the table, and our distinguished panelists, I'm sure, will have some excellent views to share on this. At the end of the day, it's all about achieving the right balance. The balance between competing players within the industry, the balance between national sovereignty and industrial flexibility, just among others. So I think that's probably enough from me. Let's just kick off with the first question to the panelists. Looking, say, 10 years ahead, if we're on this webinar in 2036, and we're looking back at the EU Space Act, what would we see as a success story, a real valuable deliverable, a valuable outcome from the Space Act? Cecile, would you like to kick off with a few thoughts on that 10-year viewpoint?
Yes, thank you, John, and good day, everyone. So you really want me to take the crystal ball now and look at how we will be in 10 years from now. I will have gray hair, and space will for sure be much busier than today. I think it's essential that fairly quickly, and for sure even before 10 years, but in 10 years, absolutely a necessity that we have a set of rules and standards which are stable. And for Europe, it's obviously essential that these rules indeed are well established for the whole of Europe, European Union, 27 member states, but even beyond. And I think that's the ambition of the European Commission, to actually do something that goes beyond Europe. And I think that's a very legitimate goal, because in fact, we are global players by our very nature. Our systems, our satellites, especially non-GSO satellites, these are constellations which run a revolution around the planet. So we need rules which not only are applicable in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. So we need standards, rules, and practices which are coordinated with the rest of the world. It needs to be global. And for that, it means that Europe needs to have a voice, a leadership on the international scene in conjunction with the other countries and the rest of the world. What would be dramatic is to do anything in Europe that is in isolation from the rest of the world. So let's make sure we do things together. And the last point, and I think that may be the most important one, we need to have a full participation of the industry and the experts into the definition of rules, standards, and practices. And I want to make very clear, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying industry should set the rules, but it's very important that the experts, the people who have the experience, are in the room to support the definition of the rules and standards.
Very helpful. Thank you for that. Shinez, would you like to give your perspective on this 10-year time horizon?
Yes, and obviously I can only echo what has just been said by my colleague Cécile, but maybe to add on to that, I think that by 2036, so 10 years from now, success would probably have mean that we have achieved a genuine single market for space in Europe. Meaning that the EU Space Act would have replaced today's fragmented national licensing regimes with more harmonized rules and also streamlined procedures across member states, and that companies would actually operate under a clear, predictable, but also proportionate conditions. Success would also mean that Europe has helped shape the global conversation on space sustainability, in a sense that the framework that we actually build under the EU Space Act should really contribute to standards that are recognized and applied internationally. And in 10 years, we should be able to say that we've genuinely helped securing the long-term sustainability of space activities. So reducing debris risk, obviously, and making space safer for everyone. And maybe last but not least, and I think probably a lot of my fellow panelists will echo that one, the real measure of success is this, that satellites actually continue to deliver for people on Earth, whether it's climate monitoring, connectivity, disaster management, or response navigation, and that a stable regulatory environment should actually allow the space sector to really fully support those goals. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Jordi, would you like to add anything to that? I appreciate we've had some pretty pretty broad and clear visions from Cécile and Shinez. Anything you'd like to add at this point?
Not at this stage. No, I think
Okay.
I echo what Cecilia and Shane has mentioned already.
Very good. Thank you. Vinny, any additional thoughts from your side, briefly?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, John and Gisela, for organizing this very important event. I really like Cecile's crystal ball. I think if it turns out to be true, I believe we'll be in a good place. And I echo 100% Shanez's comments on legal certainty, further harmonization, and achieving that true single market for space. We have to commend here Commission for the effort that they've put into drafting the draft EU Space Regulation, the EU Space Act. It is very, very complex. I believe we all spend this group quite a significant time reviewing over and over, and the interaction between what is being proposed by the Commission and principles of public international law and authorization supervision, and how to reconcile all of that with the attempt to harmonize those technical requirements. So in a scenario where the EU Space Act is adopted either in the exact form as it is now, or in a form resembling what has been proposed by the Commission, I genuinely believe that we would be in a place where we would see more harmonization of those technical requirements, more coherence in terms of the authorization and supervision of space activities in Europe, and hopefully that being, we would be served as a basis and or inspiration from other jurisdictions when they are themselves implementing their international obligations, either through the Outer Space Treaty or the long-term sustainability guidelines.
Yeah. No, that's really good to hear. And I guess just picking up on the point about harmonisation, we've heard a few times already. I guess there's an interesting question how far we see the Space Act representing a really valuable attempt to create a harmonised Europe for space in Europe, and hence enhancing global competitiveness for European industry, or, as some would perhaps suggest, is it more likely to lead to additional costs, other burdens and responsibilities on space businesses without corresponding benefits? So there's a number of sort of pull-push factors there. Shinez, I don't know if you'd like to offer a perspective on that.
Yes, sure, absolutely. So I think on our side, maybe, and to echo what Vinny just said, we do indeed commend the effort that is being put forward by the Commission. And we do genuinely see the EU Space Act as a unique opportunity. And if done right, it can actually finally create a truly harmonized market for space players in Europe, which would actually be a win, both for competitiveness, but also for sustainability. And this is really key, that this objective would actually really be achieved under certain conditions. For us, first condition is that the same rules actually must apply to everyone accessing the EU single market. And that's actually regardless of where the operators come from. So from our perspective, it's actually quite positive that the proposal subjects both EU and third country operators to the same kind of requirements. And second, and we already alluded to it, is maximum harmonization. The Act actually aims to harmonize requirements, but it also still leaves room for member states to introduce stricter national rules in certain cases. So on top of that, a single space activity could actually end up being supervised by several member states, essentially. So in our view, that kind of discretion actually risks perpetuating fragmentation rather than actually solving it, and obviously creating regulatory overlap, conflicting requirements, and even sometimes perhaps incentives for license shopping between member states. So that's exactly what we're trying to avoid here.
Sure. Yeah. Some important and interesting factors to balance up there. Cecile, do you have a perspective you'd like to share on this question, harmonisation versus sort of additional costs and burdens on the industry?
John, I think this is an issue that is common to many different sectors where Europe is regulating, and it's always a tension. And it's obviously a paradigm somehow when you want to harmonize and at the same time simplify. And when you want to act for what happens within Europe, for the EU single market, and at the same time have an impact on our business outside Europe, all of this is difficult to reconcile together. So I can only appreciate that the Commission is confronted with their proposal to a situation that is not simple. Also counting on the fact that you have 13 or more member states already having their national space law today. So exactly as she has said, if we don't have a real harmonization within the EU single market, we will probably miss one goal. On the other hand, this harmonization, if it goes too far and is harmonization par le haut, as you say in French, which means stricter, the risk there is to increase the burden overall for the players in Europe. And a side effect also could be to impact the business of European players outside Europe as a side effect, as a spillover effect, I would say. So there's really a delicate balance to find, which is have a full harmonization, but something which goes towards simplification or at least clarity and business-oriented approach, and that's where probably the participation of the industry is very important in the definition of the rules. And at the same time, make sure that we don't undermine the competitiveness of the European players.
Right.
Last but not least, and I don't want to step over the other speakers here. I think when we talk about non-European players wanting to develop business in Europe, everything needs to be on equal footing one way or another. So we need to be regulated in a way that is not going to disadvantage one type of actors over the other.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think I'd like to just move on and pick up on some of the points that have come out in just the last few minutes, really, and that is looking at the sort of expansive effect, the expansive model that the Space Act is setting up, trying to set up the harmonisation for Europe, but also roll out those new standards and obligations around the world in a similar way to what was done some years ago for GDPR. And so I think the one of the key issues there, it seems to me, is this a really helpful step towards international consistency, which across the space business is quite naturally has been difficult to achieve in many areas, or is it something that creates an unnecessary set of barriers across multinational industrial groups and their investors? Vinny, do you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, of course. And maybe I can take the opportunity to answer the previous question together with this question because they are somewhat related. So in terms of that valuable attempt on harmonization, I mean, I of course echo all the previous comments, and perhaps the most lawyer answer or comment that I can make is that it really depends on how this is done. So we all know what is the legal basis that Commission has used and has been using to push forward for harmonizing those technical requirements. And as Cecile mentioned, we do have an existing number of member states in the EU which have adopted national space legislation, and an emerging proliferation of other states adopting national space legislation. So what the EU Space Act, at least in the first instance, doesn't address necessarily is the harmonization on the points beyond what would be harmonized by those technical requirements. And that is a certain discretion that is retained. Now, Genèse mentioned a point which we completely agree here at national scale, is that the current draft, which is obviously subject to the legislative process with the European Parliament and Council, still enables a divergence of those harmonized technical requirements in some specific circumstances. And because it is arguable whether or not Commission can go as far as to harmonize, for instance, scope of application of national space legislation, it creates that imbalance and a situation that instead of minimizing dual licensing situations, we end up increasing the likelihood of that happening. So there's a very curious article in the draft today that essentially requires authorization in the member state of establishment and then the member state where the space activity is taking place and so on. So some of these aspects are not necessarily being created by the EU Space Act, but how is being proposed and the mechanism once adopted would end up creating these situations whereby as an operator and looking at the kind of space services and space operations that are covered by the current regulation and the draft regulation could create a little bit more complexity than it solves. Now, in terms of that harmonization of those technical requirements, perhaps my colleagues I can't speak for my colleagues here, but they can echo that we do have a set of international standards, internationally recognized standards and guidelines on space debris mitigation, but we still struggle with the implementation as part of legislative and regulatory frameworks of those international standards. Now, countries, they choose to do that in different ways. And if you look at the long-term sustainability guidelines, there are guidelines about updating and adopting national legal frameworks, and there is a reference to international standards, including ISO standards, and we've been seeing new draft legislation that either make what we call normative references to those non-legally binding instruments. Sometimes they mention space debris mitigation guidelines very broadly, as we do here in the UK. So we've been seeing that slow pace of implementation in the first instance of national space legislation to deliver on that international obligation for states to authorize and continuously supervise, etc. So a slow adoption as a result of those quote unquote more sustainable practices. And I'm walking towards my conclusion. So when we look at the draft EU Space Act today, all those articles and provisions pertaining to space debris mitigation and maneuverability and so on, collision avoidance, and we look at the annexes of the draft, we fundamentally don't have a lot of issue with what is being set up there. But obviously the devil is in the detail, and the detail is being left to be decided later on through implementing and delegated acts.
Okay.
But it is a very, very golden opportunity, as mentioned earlier, that in this attempt, whether Commission and the co-legislators decide to effectively incorporate those internationally recognized standards, including ISO or IEDC, and that would serve as a basis and would create that ripple Brussels effect for market access. That has a lot of potential to trigger in all of those states adopting national space legislation to effectively adopt what almost universally we can all agree that is the minimum that is expected of responsible and sustainable operators today, which is compliance to those international standards.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop here because this is a fascinating question.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think there's clearly huge opportunities for Europe, if you like, to set the tone for the next generation. And the question, as always, is how far that actually is something that other nation states, other spacefaring nations are happy and willing to adopt. Shinez, do you have thoughts on this question? International consistency, setting new standards, or is it more of a sort of establishing undesirable barriers potentially?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will be very brief, but I think there are a few things to be mentioned, and maybe just to complete what has already been said, right? So I think standards and interoperability are actually really central to making the EU Space Act future-proof. In space, technology cycles are really fast, and business models also are changing quite fast. So for me, there are like three guiding principles, if I may put it like that. The first one is, technology agnosticism, so that the framework should actually rely on open standards and avoid creating any prescriptive requirements that requires operator to use this or that technology. That would be the first. The second, and I think it's like a bit of the obvious one, is adaptive regulation, right? And in emerging areas, for example, like in-orbit servicing, Vinny, you actually inspired me that one. We should be careful not to impose premature and rigid requirements. In sectors like in-orbit services, I think voluntary and phased frameworks are actually the right type of frameworks to making sure we actually foster innovation instead of creating costs that might actually discourage investments and yeah. And then the third one is obviously the collaborative governance. And that comes back to what Cécile, I think, was saying at the beginning of the webinar, which is making sure that essentially industry expertise is actually embedded in the decision-making process. So, it's really our view that regulations will only remain effective if they are actually grounded in operational reality. And that's where dialogue between regulators and industry, satellite operators with hands-on experience is actually key for this kind of endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd all recognise the technological and indeed commercial complexity of the sector that we're operating in. So having people in the room who actually understand that complexity and how the new regime will play out is clearly vital. Jordi, would you like to offer your viewpoint on these questions around the sort of the international consistency piece and the value of standards and interoperability and open architectures?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the question, Jon. Of course, as an international business, but I think more generally for any satellite operator, this is a by its nature global business. I think consistency, not only at the level of the EU, but internationally, is very important. At Amazon Leo, we fully support the goals and the vision of the European Space Act for a safe and sustainable space environment, and of course, we have integrated ourselves in our constellation, space safety principles from day one. But I think what is important to remember is that this European proposal is not going to be landing in a regulatory vacuum. And what I mean by that is that there already exist safety and sustainability frameworks worldwide, and not only mandatory frameworks, but also many international standards and best practices that have been developed collaboratively by both industry and experts, for example, at space agencies. And so I think it's fair to say that today there is already a good understanding of what kind of requirements, for example, in the area of debris mitigation work. And so, for example, if you look at research that has been conducted by the European Space Agency, and you can find this in the publications from ESA. What they show is that there are, in particular, three key requirements when it comes to debris mitigation. The first one is that there is a 90% probability of successful disposal, and this means that whenever your satellite has finalized its mission, there should be at least a 90% probability that you can safely remove that spacecraft from its orbit. So that's one. The second one is a post-mission disposal time of at most 25 years, so less than 25 years. So you need to make sure that you remove that spacecraft in less than 25 years. And finally, a 100% passivation rate particularly for operators that are in higher orbits. And that means that you remove any source of energy from the spacecraft. And that's very important because if you leave energy that can provoke explosions in the future, or if there is a collision, can create a lot more debris. So those are actually three key requirements that ESA has modeled, that if they were complied by all operators, that would stabilize over time the space environment in terms of debris. And so I think we already have a good understanding of what it is that works. What is missing is really compliance with these frameworks. For example, ESA as well has conducted research, and what they show is that constellations in low Earth orbit have a 95% compliance rate at clearing orbits within 5 years, 99% compliance rate within 25 years. So constellations in Leo are already complying with these requirements. Now, who are not complying with these requirements according to ESA? Well, it's non-constellations, and they estimate that compliance by constellations is only at 75% for 5 years, and 85% for post-mission disposal time at 25 years. So that doesn't get to the 90% that we know it's necessary. So that's why we think that the EU Space Act is a great opportunity for two things. First of all, ensure that the requirements that are in the end, as Vinny was saying, that we cannot see them in the text because they are delayed for implementing acts, but ensuring that the requirements in the Space Act are aligned with international standards and best practices, for example, ISO, which already incorporate the requirements that I was mentioning earlier. And secondly, to ensure compliance with those requirements. As I said, there's a relatively high level of non-compliance from non-constellations operators. And I think, and maybe with this I finish, I think that the risk that we see with the current proposal from the Commission is that we see already that this is not the way that the text is going. Why? First of all, we see that there's a distinction between operators. In fact, the text is actually identifying 5 different types of operators. So we have research and education missions that are exempted from some requirements. We have operators with less than 10 spacecraft, which we assume will have a different set of requirements. Then we have constellations with more than 10 satellites. Then we have mega constellations with more than 100. And finally, we have giga constellations with more than 1,000. Now, that seems to suggest that we're going to have a puzzle of different groups with different rules, when what we think is necessary is really that we make sure that everyone is complying with the necessary requirements that I mentioned earlier, and that they apply uniformly. And I'll link this also to one point that was mentioned earlier around the level playing field. I think we understand, the demand from EU operators to make sure that non-EU operators comply with the same requirements than EU operators. But if we start making groups, and in particular, if we start creating groups like giga constellations, where effectively we're going to have just 1 or 2 constellations, non-European constellations being part of that group, and then creating a separate set of rules for those operators, then we are not meeting this level playing field, because we're going to have a different set of rules for US constellations as opposed to European players. And I'll close.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for sharing those perspectives. Really, really helpful. I guess just sort of moving on a little bit. We talked quite a lot about sustainability and the debris mitigation guidelines that we're all familiar with, and how the existing guidelines fit with the ambition set out in the Act. I guess the one of the issues with sustainability, and indeed with the other key areas, resilience and safety, is how far does it make sense to look at generating defined, definitive, hardwired standards that everybody should take on board with effect from 2030, assuming that's when the Act comes into play? Or how far should we actually be looking at something that's a little bit more flexible, a little bit more adaptable as a framework, to recognise that the best understanding now will evolve over the next decade, over the years to come, and therefore what we look at in 2036 or 2040, the appropriate standards may need to be flexible to respond to that. Cecile, do you want to offer any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you touch upon a point which is extremely important, John, because we need to ensure both certainty and a certain degree of flexibility, and be able to evolve. We cannot set in stone specific requirements on debris mitigation or light pollution or end of life type of requirements. We cannot set them in stone for decades now without having the option to change them over time. I think this is the idea which the Commission had in having a framework instrument like the Space Act, and propose to have implementing acts and secondary legislation in order to look at the specific technical requirements. Now, the text, as it was drafted originally, probably sometimes mix up a little bit the two ideas, and it happens that sometimes some technical requirements are already mentioned in the EU Space Act, whereas on the other hand, some implementing acts seem to be designed to go beyond the definition of technical requirements. All of this needs to be rectified in such a way that indeed implementing acts or secondary legislation or delegated acts, because there are also different types of secondary legislation, can be adopted in a second stage and modified much more easily than just revisiting the whole framework, right? And I think there is one very important point which the Commission needs to be aware of, and I think they start to realize that. There are so many things which are covered by the proposal, so many areas and so many references to implementing acts and secondary legislation. We will have to set priorities. Europe will have to decide where we want to have our first requirements and start with that. Otherwise, we will never be able to accommodate everything in all sectors. And that's probably where I would say, and I hope I echo a lot of consensus, our priority should be really on space safety, space traffic management. This is where the need is critical, and that's the primary objective of this Space Act.
Very helpful. Okay. Shinez, would you like to add or maybe amplify some of those points?
Yeah, problem is I often agree with Cécile, but I'll try to add on to that absolutely. But for me, and thanks again for the question, because I think it's a very important one. There is a clear middle ground between fostering innovative sustainability standards and enabling the evolution of existing internationally recognized rules, right? So on the one hand, we absolutely need to raise the bar on sustainability, and I think that Europe should not be afraid of putting forward new regulatory requirements, especially when we're talking about the long-term safety of the orbital environment. And from our perspective, we actually need stronger requirements or at least new requirements in areas where they're lacking, right? So collision avoidance, traffic coordination, maneuverability, trackability are all areas where new requirements don't really feel like a burden, at least from a Eutelsat perspective, but rather as a positive evolution towards a safer and more sustainable space environment. And so we welcome that direction. And by the way, it's also worth saying that this approach is not at all revolutionary, in a sense that some other countries have already taken, similar steps by attaching sustainability-related conditions to the access to their market, right? But also at the same time, it's also really important that regulation remains realistic from an operational standpoint, and that those obligations are actually pragmatic, grounded in really like solid science. So if you take the idea, for instance, of one of the requirements that is laid out in the EU Space Act relates to the selection of orbit based on sustainability metrics, like a notion of orbital congestion. And here the challenge is mainly that, the methodologies behind these metrics are not actually fully agreed or validated or developed. And so if we hardwire certain concepts into regulation too early on, then we actually risk creating more uncertainty and probably unintended consequences. So yes to ambition, yes to sustainability leadership, but we also need rules that are both forward-looking and operationally sound for operators to implement.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Vinny, what's your perspective on this sort of dilemma between achieving certainty, the benefits, but possibly the uncertainties around some delegated legislation, and yet the recognition that the industry, the technology we're all working with, and the acceptable standards will evolve? Where do we strike that balance?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, that's the million-pound question, isn't it, John? Is the balance between, and I think here in the UK we are very much close to this reality, but how do we strike the balance between an outcome-based approach and one that is not prescriptive and provides that high level and degree of flexibility, with a certain level of prescriptiveness that I believe discussing with systems engineers and the people with the boots on the ground designing and building spacecraft, they would agree that a certain level of prescriptiveness is actually very important to ensure that the licensing process goes smoothly and it doesn't add time and complexity to that assessment from a regulator or from the national authority in deciding whether or not that mission should be licensed or not. So it is fundamental. So now what we see in the draft is an attempt by the European Commission to reconcile these two things. Now we might have diverging opinions of whether or not they struck a good balance, because again, it's difficult to make that final assessment and determination because the numerical thresholds are not yet known. But what we discussed amongst ourselves and what I discussed internally is that at least on a fundamental, on a principle level, we don't necessarily have an objection to what is being, in general, of course, with some exceptions, some exceptions in instances where a commission made the attempt of being overly prescriptive. So my colleagues mentioned a couple of examples, at least in the body of the regulation, that we thought, regardless of whether or not we agree with that threshold, we just thought it was inappropriate for it to be outlined in the body of the regulation. Another point that was mentioned is the overlap that we see often between safety and sustainability. So I don't disagree that we have to be mindful of the long-term sustainability of aerospace activities, and with that understanding, so borrowing the definition that is outlined in the long-term sustainability guidelines, so ensuring the space environment for future generations, et cetera, there is a significant overlap between safety and sustainability. And when we look at robust legal and regulatory frameworks that exist, at least today, we do see that oftentimes we deliver meaningfully on some of the most commonly talked about space sustainability objectives by addressing the space safety element of space activities and space operations. Now, in terms of that level of prescriptiveness, I think all of our companies have both operations in Europe, in the EU, and outside of the EU. I think the overarching objective here, and I know we talked about harmonization several times already, but to prevent a scenario whereby my colleague Shenez, when she's interacting with her regulator, she's subject to one set of technical requirements, whereas Cecile in another EU member state will be subject to a completely different set of those technical requirements. And this is what overall we will want to avoid. Now, we at Astroscale, we genuinely believe that there is a Goldilocks zone. There is a sweet spot between adopting and retaining a framework that remains somewhat flexible. So when we have language about operators should mitigate the generation of space debris, etc., I don't believe none of us would have objections to that being the overall and overarching objective. And ISO, for instance, was mentioned a few times, IATC guidelines. So all of that is relatively uncontroversial amongst the systems engineers and people actually designing, building, and launching spacecraft into outer space. Now, it is a very difficult legislative regulatory exercise to find that Goldilocks zone and sweet spot. So how far can we go and how prescriptive can we be without hindering innovation and so on? And the last example that I can mention, for example, coming from an ISO's operator such as Scale, is that when I look at Annex 5, for example, when we have Article 7, which is the one on space debris mitigation, expanded a little bit more, which is interesting because we have Annex 5, which makes reference to, Article 7, which makes reference to Annex 5, and Annex 5 makes reference to a lot of things to be decided through implementing acts. But in any case, we have a specific paragraph that talks about, for example, removal of spacecraft in LEO. And then it provides a list in an order of precedence. So that provision is very specific about the order of precedence that operators need to adopt when we are talking about removal of spacecraft in LEO from LEO. And a comment from obviously from my perspective is that removal by ISOs is the very last element. Now, obviously, I completely agree with my colleagues that I don't believe we are ready to mandate certain solutions or technological solutions to deliver on those objectives. I'm very much of the opinion that it should be up to the operators to decide how they would comply with the overarching safety and sustainability requirements that they are subject to. But also that includes in terms of language that is used in regulation that fixes that order of priority, which means that if any of my colleagues here in our colleagues from Eutelsat, SES, or Amazon LEO conclude that the best solution for their operations is to remove this spacecraft through external services, the regulation doesn't necessarily allow them to do that. So it's just one example of, it is difficult, but we do engage with the Commission. We did engage and we do engage with the Commission, and I conclude, and we are engaging with the co-legislators to, for the lack of a better way to put it, educate them about the challenge of delivering a robust, future-proof, comprehensive, proportionate set of regulatory requirements.
Very helpful. Thanks, Vinny. Just for the audience members, if you have any questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A. If we don't have time to pick them up, then we'll do our best after the webinar closes. Can I just move to a slightly different perspective, and that's the cybersecurity requirements, because reading the Act, they set out a number of important and well-meaning standards about cybersecurity. But I think there is perhaps a bit of an open question how far they dovetail with the existing NIS2 requirements. And does that mean that among the industrial players, businesses might get confused about which element of space business is covered by NIS2, possibly the ground segment, possibly something else? Which elements are covered by the Space Act? Do they fit happily together? Are they expecting some somewhat different sets of implementation? Does this undermine the effectiveness? Jordi, do you want to offer your perspective on that?
Sure, John. Thanks a lot for the question. As you mentioned, so I think if I were to summarize what the Commission's proposal intends to do is basically to create a lex specialis on cybersecurity that would apply to the space sector beyond horizontal regulations that already exist, like NIS2 or the CER directives. If you've seen the Danish presidency's compromise text, which I think has had quite a lot of support in the council, in the section, in the parts on cybersecurity, I think what the council is trying to do is to move away from a situation where the EU Space Act would create a lex specialis and instead go back to ensuring that NIS2 and CER directives apply to the space sector. And I think from an Amazon Leo perspective, we agree with the approach proposed by the Danish presidency. We think that the proposals in the EU Space Act, well, they created a risk of imposing like complex and duplicative compliance burdens on space operators. What the EU Space Act proposes is basically to introduce prescriptive sector-specific requirements that in some cases exceed NIS2 and SIR standards without a very clear assessment of why that would be necessary or how they would bring benefits to the sector. So in our view, it's unclear that the approach proposed by the Commission would, deliver material risk mitigation improvements beyond what NIS2 or SIR already do. So instead of that, I think we would prefer a streamlined approach that leverages NIS2 and SIR frameworks, and maybe if we want to complement that with sector-specific guidelines, we think that could achieve a better cybersecurity outcome than what is proposed in the existing EU Space Act.
Okay, thank you very much. Cecile, is this something you'd like to offer your perspective on? Cybersecurity, NIS2, Cyber Resilience Act, how do they all fit together? Does it fit happily, or is it a bit of a mixed bag?
I think the Commission's intention, and this is a discussion we had with them directly, was again laudable. They wanted to go a step beyond in terms of harmonization, and they had in mind to try and have a sector-specific approach that would be more direct and somehow based on a regulation rather than the existing directives. It's getting too complicated when you look at the original proposal, and I think Georgie explained it very well. There's definitely too much risk that we end up with something which will lead our sector to depend on various supervision authorities and with compliance obligations which may overlap or even maybe in sometimes contradict with each other. It's interesting to look, and I'm inviting all people interested to look more in detail at this. It's interesting to look at the impact assessment that was released together with the proposal, where there is a very good analysis actually of the missing gaps in terms of cybersecurity that may exist in the space satellite sector. And when you look at it, and especially in reference to NIS2, but also the Cyber Resilience Act, which surprisingly is not mentioned in the proposal itself. Well, in fact, space segment and ground segment are covered together with transmission. So there's not so much that is missing. And at the end, the Danish proposal is going towards the idea of just proposing to fill in the gaps, but we feel that it may be even simpler than that because the bulk of it is already covered. So at the end, we can have something much simpler. Yes.
Very good. I'm sure all of us would support the idea of simplicity, and maybe that's actually a good note on which to close. Unfortunately, time's up against us, but we've come to the end of today's discussion. Sorry to the audience members who've submitted their questions. We'll do our best to answer those separately after the webinar closes, posted alongside the video on the GSOA site. First up, thank you very much to our panelists for a fascinating discussion and some insights into some of the knotty questions that we're all grappling with at the moment. Hopefully that's given you, the audience, some good good thoughts to reflect on. Do join us again for the next GSOA event. Details on the website. The event will be on the 19th of March. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.